Those at the English College in Prague know me as the person who works with our alumni and arranges for them to come into school to talk about their careers. But before moving to Prague with Mr. Emerson, I worked in UK politics, and I'd like to tell you something about my career in case any of you are thinking of studying politics at university, but don't know the sort of jobs that might be open to you afterwards. I had always been interested in politics at school, and I was the student member of a delegation of staff and parents who went down to the Houses of Parliament in London to protest against the then Labour government's plans to abolish what was called the direct grant, which was very similar to the subsidy the Czech government gives to the English college for each Czech student. It was what enabled bright students to attend independent schools in England, very much like the English college. The direct grant enabled me to be awarded a scholarship, without which my parents would not have been able to afford the school fees. My father was a Czech butcher who had escaped to the UK from Třinec at the start of World War II, where he joined the Royal Air Force. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the English College is because it was set up with very similar aims and ideals as my own school, Manchester High School for Girls, which had been founded in 1874 and had always been a campaigning school for girls' education. It had been attended by the leading suffragettes, the Pankhurst sisters, who led the fight for votes for women. So, given my interest in politics, my choice of subject at university was easy: politics. You may not be quite so sure what to study at university, but it's always a good idea to study a subject you're interested in. That might sound obvious, but sometimes the subject you're best at school is not always the one you're most interested in. I chose a course called Political Theory and Institutions at the University of Liverpool. The course had all the essentials of political philosophy, from Plato and Aristotle through Marx and Engels to Popper and Hayek. But I also studied courses such as political sociology and American politics and comparative communist governments, which I have to say, I'm sorry, Mr. Hudson, I found much more interesting than political philosophy. But although your choice of subject and course at university is important, so too is the place you go to study. You have to like where you're going to live for the next 3 years. So visit the university before you apply if you can, and talk to people who come from there. You can choose the best course for your subject, but if it's in a place you don't like, you're going to have a pretty miserable 3 years. And all the time I was studying in Liverpool, I worked as a volunteer for the Conservative Party, campaigning in local elections, delivering leaflets and canvassing. Then after university, I moved to a place called Pendle in North East Lancashire and spent the next couple of years working at the local job centre, helping find jobs for unemployed people, which was very interesting and rewarding. I was also chairman of the local Young Conservatives, and when, in May 1979, when Margaret Thatcher became the UK's first woman Prime Minister, the local Conservative candidate, who I had helped get elected and won the seat from Labour, asked me if I wanted to move down to London to work for him at the House of Commons. Did I want to go from being a junior civil servant to working for an MP? It took me about 5 seconds to decide the answer was yes. What this showed me was the importance of always doing the best job you can in case the people watching you are in a position to help you in your career. I have only ever applied for one job in my life, the one straight from university. Every other job I have been asked if I wanted to do. So, for the next 12 years, I worked for the Member of Parliament for Pendle as his constituency secretary and research assistant in the House of Commons. MPs in those days had a much smaller allowance to pay staff than they do nowadays. So they usually had just one member of staff, whereas now they can afford to pay 3 or 4. But this meant that the work was very varied. I drafted his replies to letters he received from his constituents on all sorts of subjects, from asking for his help with a problem they were having with the local council, to lobbying him with their views on abortion or on animal rights, two of the big issues of the day. I also had to research the background to all sorts of subjects to help the MP prepare his speeches in Parliament. I wrote press releases, and I also helped design and write his campaign literature. Then in October 1991, I went to lunch in the House of Commons with a group of friends to celebrate my birthday. Sitting next to me was an older friend who worked for John Major, our new Prime Minister. Over lunch, she told me that she intended retiring at the next general election and that John Major wanted me to take over from her. I had covered for her that summer when she was on holiday, and I'd obviously done a good enough job for John Major to think that I could take over from her. It was a great honour. So there I was in May 1992, after the general election, working for the Prime Minister with my own office in 10 Downing Street. My title was Constituency Secretary, and I worked for the Prime Minister in his capacity as MP for Huntingdon near Cambridge. Because I worked for him personally, I was unique in Downing Street because everyone else was either a civil servant or they worked for the Conservative Party. John Major used to joke that I ran Huntingdon while he ran the country. It wasn't true, of course, but it did mean that I was the liaison between the constituency and Downing Street, and everything to do with Huntingdon had to pass through me. One of my main jobs was to organise his constituency days in Huntingdon. The British Prime Minister is still an MP for an area of about 65,000 people, and so once a month he would spend the whole Friday in Huntingdon visiting schools, businesses and the local hospital, meeting people and hearing about their jobs, their studies and their views, and inevitably about their complaints. He also held a monthly advice bureau where constituents could come to talk to him in confidence about problems they might be having and to enlist his help. Visiting politicians from abroad were always amazed that he still did this, despite the pressures of being Prime Minister. But we explained that it's an important feature of the UK political system. I met some of the great political figures of those days, such as Nelson Mandela, George Bush Senior and Bill Clinton. I learnt a lot in the years I worked in Downing Street. We had very efficient and well thought out systems, and I learned how to be very organised. However, by 1997, the Conservatives had fallen out of favour with the electorate, largely because of a very unpopular policy called the community charge that became labelled the poll tax, which sought to introduce a fairer method of funding local government spending. It had been introduced by Margaret Thatcher and was responsible for her downfall as leader of the Conservative Party. Although John Major had reformed and improved it, it wasn't enough, and, as he said at the time, we had stretched the democratic elastic too far. We lost the general election and Tony Blair was elected Prime Minister. This is when I learnt firsthand how brutal the British political system is. The result had become obvious in the early hours of the morning after the election, and I remember driving back from Huntingdon to Downing Street in the dark and spending the next 10 hours packing up my office and driving boxes of files and equipment over to the Leader of the Opposition's office in the House of Commons. A defeated Prime Minister has to clear out of Downing Street overnight to allow the new administration to take over the very next day. John Major carried on as a backbench MP until the 2001 general election, and I then went to work as political advisor to the opposition chief whip in the House of Commons. What does that mean? Well, if you think of the business of the House of Commons as being like a play, the whips are the stage managers who make sure everyone knows when they're due on stage and has their scripts. The government's whip's office is to make sure that the government's legislation gets through the House of Commons, and the role of the opposition whips is to do what they can to make it as difficult as possible for them. As political advisor, one of my jobs was to chair regular meetings of the chiefs of staff of the members of the shadow cabinet to go through the business that would be coming in front of the House in the next 2 weeks, and where they would explain their minister's business. Most of the members of that group are now MPs and even ministers, including Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, who is leading the UK government's fight against COVID-19. I became an expert in parliamentary procedure, and I enjoyed the cat and mouse game of trying to thwart the government's plans. But it wasn't all about legislation and tactics. The Conservative Party at the time was very male and very white, and I worked with the team who were trying to change that. I am delighted that the current Conservative government under Boris Johnson is the most diverse in history, with record numbers of women and BAME ministers, and with British Asians as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary, the two most senior positions after the Prime Minister. I was then asked to head up a new department of the Conservative Party, and I took on the job of Head of Shadow Cabinet Liaison. What that meant was that I coordinated the work of our shadow ministers to make sure everyone knew what everyone else was doing and to ensure that we had what we called joined up opposition. One of my main tasks was to organise shadow ministers' regional tours to make sure that in the run-up to the next general election, all parts of the country regularly had visits from shadow ministers from all the different departments. I liaised with the local party and the media, organising visits to schools and hospitals and all the logistics that go with that. On any one Friday, I would have around 6 or 8 shadow cabinet members out and about around the country, carrying out up to 50 or 60 engagements, all of which I had to organise. So it was very important to be organised, to make sure everyone knew what they were supposed to be doing, and that everyone who needed to know was fully briefed on the plans. It taught me the importance of checking everything to make sure that any mistakes were picked up before they were able to ruin an event. But then in January 2007, Mr. Emerson became Head of Science at the English College, and I decided that the time had come to leave politics behind and to move to my late father's homeland. But politics is not a job, it's a way of life. I was privileged to be able to work for a cause I believed in a succession of fascinating jobs. And if you have a cause you care about, there is no more satisfying career to follow. But it doesn't have to be party politics, as in my case. If you care passionately about climate change, for example, or about helping people less fortunate than you, why not explore careers that might be open to you in those fields? The ECP has graduates in many different areas, including NGOs. So it's worth asking if we have somebody who would be willing to talk to you about their career in a field you are interested in. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your career choice.